Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Jen with Sloat Garden Center. I'm just going to say a few things while people are logging on. First of all, we're really excited to have Suzanne back this week, Suzanne Bontempo with Our Water, Our World, to talk about organic veggie gardening. There couldn't be a more perfect day to talk about organic veggie gardening. So we need to get this moving so you all can get outside and plant your veggies. I do want to say that we have a poll going. If you can take a moment and fill it out, we'd like to look at the results before Suzanne does her presentation. I do want to say that this class is starting off sort of a series of classes that we're going to have for the next, I think, 6 weeks on different edible gardening techniques, as well as pest and disease identification and attracting pollinators and um, uh, non-toxic maintenance and whatnot, which is all super important to stay ahead of just going into the season. So a lot of really good information coming up. And if you do have a question, feel free to drop it in the Q&A. We might take a couple questions throughout the presentation, but we're going to reserve the majority of the questions towards the end of the presentation. And so we'll try to address as many as possible. I do want to let you know some not so good news is if you were wondering about the webinar recording from last week, I accidentally erased it. And so we do not have that webinar recording, unfortunately, of Elizabeth Ruiz's pruning azaleas, camellias, and hydrangeas. So we'll have her back to do that again, I guess, next year. And hopefully there's a lot that's, that you learn that's still there. Okay, let's
And
look at the
they're
poll.
saying that they don't see the poll.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, beautiful.
Do you see it now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm very excited about this poll.
Okay, good. Yeah, there we go.
Very excited.
Okay. Yeah, and then just letting you know, let's see, next week we have citrus pruning, and that is with Elizabeth Ruiz. And then the week after is tomato 101. So it's happening. We are getting into spring mode, edible gardening.
I know. It's exciting.
I know. Okay, so let's see. A lot of people in Contra Costa, and most have grown their own veggies before.
Oh, good.
And most prefer organic gardening.
Oh, wonderful.
92%. Awesome. Okay, this is really helpful information. Thank you.
How many folks are coming from Marin and San Francisco? Is there a percentage that you
Let's
can see?
see. San Francisco 32% and Marin 18%.
Okay.
South San Francisco 5%.
Wonderful.
Outside of Bay 5%. Very cool.
Okay, I'm just
All right.
taking a minute
Well,
to look at these questions before we get started. Okay.
really happy to have your
Okay.
presentation. Have you back again, Suzanne. So I'm looking forward to all the info you have to share.
Okay,
Thanks
sorry.
again.
Okay, thanks everyone. Let's get started then. I know the poll is really fun to check out, so I appreciate everyone's patience with that. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm so excited to be here today to talk with all of you about growing food organically. This is something that I've been doing for many, 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 many years, and I really love to share stories about this. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through slides for about 45 minutes. I do have a little bit more content than normal or than I have in the past. that I feel is really important to share. And then we're going to go through any questions at the end. So jot those questions down as they come up. And then we'll continue moving through the program, and then we'll have questions at the end. So what we're going to learn about this morning is setting up your veggie garden for success. And we're going to just touch on the best ways to fertilize and increasing soil health, companion planting, and crop rotation. And then we're going to take some time to talk about how IPM plays the big role with the success. And that's by, and how we can reduce pest problems by applying IPM strategies. So by now, if you've been in one of my programs, you certainly know what IPM stands for, right? But for those of you that don't, it stands for Integrated Pest Management. And I'm the program manager for a program that's throughout the Bay Area and pretty much throughout Northern California. It's called Our Water, Our World. And we are an IPM educational program for the public. And we partner with water pollution prevention agencies and retailers. And we are here to guide folks to solve their pest problems with a less toxic approach. And you can find our materials at many of our local retailers are all around the Bay Area. Little blue tags that indicate the less toxic products. And you can always go to the ourwaterourworld.org website for more information. So with a quick review of what IPM is, because everyone knows how I like to start with this. Remember, it is a decision-making process that uses science-based information. So that's really important, especially when we're talking about companion planting and things like that. This is science-based. We're always going to look at the system as a whole to identify what the problem possibly could be. And we really want to hone in and make sure we're always able to identify what that problem is. A lot of times what we're seeing are symptoms of a problem. And then once we can identify that problem, we decide if we can live with it. Like, is it a big deal, or is it something that we really need to take some action? And then the types of actions that we take are a combination between cultural controls, which is increasing the health of the garden, mechanical controls, which are the different types of tools we use to manage the pest, biological controls, which are the living organisms we use to manage the pests, and then chemical controls, which are the pesticides. And we always want to use these as a last resort. Oftentimes with all of those other practices in place, we don't need pesticides, but we're always going to use the least toxic, eco-friendly ones. And we're going to make sure we're always just going to apply according to the pest situation. So with that said, let's talk about setting our vegetable garden up for success. We apply IPM methods to growing our food by increasing the health of the soil, always. Everything in the garden starts with the soil. So we're going to amend the soil. It could be raised bed, it could be in the ground, it could be container, it could be a half barrel, whatever it is. We want to, as we're planting our vegetables or any type of food crops or any type of plants, we're going to amend that soil with some compost. We can also do a top dressing of compost. However, we want to be mindful that we're not coming up around the crowns of the plants. And the reason why is that the compost just has so many benefits for increasing the health of the soil, and by adding more microbiology to the soil, as well as increasing the water holding capacity, increasing the health of the plants, and so forth. We're going to amend our soil with any type of product that might say compost or soil amend, planting mix, raised bed mix, soil builder or loam builder. These are really all the same. These are going to be products that are essentially things, compost, that it just has different types of marketing labels for adding to our soils to amend it. This also goes for raised beds and larger containers. If you have a small container, you might want to consider using a potting mix to amend your soil, because potting mix or potting soil has special ingredients to help with the drainage, and that would be for really small containers. But for half barrels, for large tubs, for raised beds, we can amend with any types of these products. And the fundamental reason why is because we want to increase the beneficial bacteria and beneficial fungi. So these are going to be the nutrient transport enhancement systems that really help our plants thrive. So I'm a huge fan of the microbiology in our soil and keeping it at its optimum health. And we do that by feeding the soil with organic fertilizers. Organic fertilizers are a much more sustainable way to feed our plants. It will allow the nutrients to be absorbed by the plant when the plant needs it. It's not going to contaminate waterways. It's not going to burn our plants. And it also is going, because it's feeding our plants in a very natural way, it's going to prevent a lot of artificial growth spurts or plant growth getting stimulated often. And the reason why this is so important is because insects really like and thrive on the fresh, tender new growth that is produced by plants. And if we're feeding our plants with synthetic fertilizers, these synthetic fertilizers kind of act like steroids for the plants, and it's stimulating a lot of new growth at an unnatural rate, and thus the pest insects and the diseases will come to attack that plant. So it is just always a good rule of thumb to always apply with organic fertilizers. Now, these are dry fertilizers that I will work into the soil at time of planting my plants. I can also share that your vegetables, any of your food crops would certainly benefit from working with a little bit of alfalfa meal in addition to that other dry organic fertilizer. Alfalfa meal is an incredible food for your plants. Not only does it add nitrogen, but it also adds trace minerals to your soil that are going to just be beneficial for improving the health of your soil as well as improving the health of your plants. Alfalfa meal is also known to improve the tilth of your soil, which is so beneficial. And it also contains this very fascinating natural fatty acid, which is a growth stimulant called, can you pronounce this one? Triangantol. I'm not going to try it again. You all get what I'm saying. If anyone wants to help me pronounce it at the end of the program, I welcome it. But anyway, so that's something I'd just like to share about alfalfa meal. I'm a huge fan. I'm also a huge fan of earthworm castings. The earthworm castings are superfoods for your veggie crops. They earthworm castings is pretty much like a little bit of gold that you can add around your plants and work into the soil. You don't need very much. It's typically just a couple tablespoons per plant ish. You know, if we're doing an entire raised bed of planting new little veggie starts, I might just kind of sprinkle the earthworm castings over the soil, but I always want to kind of slightly work it in. It's ideal not to have the earthworm castings sitting on top of the soil, unlike compost, which we can top dress, but earthworm castings really wants to be integrated into the soil. Earthworm castings contain these incredible enzymes and also beneficial bacteria and humus that is very unique to earthworm castings, but will just further enhance the health of the soil. It also helps provide dynamic root growth and plant structure. The coolest thing about earthworm castings is it's highly, because of these enzymes that are found and these beneficial bacteria that are found in the earthworm castings, it makes them highly effective for preventing insect pests as well as inhibiting diseases. So it almost is like it's going through the whole structure of the plant to fight off insects and diseases, which is phenomenal. So to increase the health of your food gardens, please apply some earthworm castings around the soil. It also helps neutralize the pH, or I should say balance the pH in a way that is best for the plants and nutrient uptakes of those plants. So in addition to the dry organic fertilizer, I'm a huge fan of the liquid organic fertilizers, and I'll tell you why. Okay, so we've planted our food crops, and I'm talking about like possibly annual food crops. But at any time of planting, we're going to amend that soil. We're adding the dry fertilizer. Those plants are going to be able to access that beautiful food. But then throughout the growing season, a really easy way to apply fertilizer is by working with these liquid fertilizers. What I do is I just mix it in my watering can according to the label's directions, and I will go ahead and feed as a soil drench my food crops. The reason why I like to work with the liquids is, one, it's faster and easier for me because I've got quite a bit of food out there that I have to fertilize. And two, I don't have to worry about disrupting the mulch or trying to dig in dry fertilizer around root systems. This simply is just getting absorbed as a liquid food for my plants. It is really nice to apply 1 to 2 times a month according to the label's directions. So that's just something I like to share. And I'm also a huge fan of anything that has kelp in it, because kelp is another one of those superfoods for our plants that acts as a healthy cell growth stimulator, which is fantastic. This is a really cool product, a really great fertilizer that you'll see at some of our local garden centers like Sloat. This is our Pacific Northwest Organics Ocean Gold. It is blended in a way that is allows it to have a little bit of a higher content of calcium, which is ideal for our tomatoes and some of our summer squashes. Something to keep in mind though, if you notice that first number on the NPK, the nitrogen number is 2. It's a little higher than the 1 or the 0.03. So you don't want to overdo it. So this would just maybe be a nice thing to alternate with one of these liquid fertilizers so that we have a balance and it's not going to just strictly be high nitrogen, but it's very an excellent high quality fertilizer for our veggie gardens. Of course, we always want to apply a nice layer of mulch around our food crops and our because it's going to reduce water evaporation rate. It's going to keep the soil cool in the summer, warmer in the winter. As it breaks down, it's feeding the soil, and it also creates habitat for some of our good insects. You'll see that on the left, I have an arbor chip mulch that's just like a chipped up wood bark or wood mulch, whereas the photo on the right is straw. So when you can find rice straw is another really great material to use around raised beds and pathways, but also on the food crops. It takes, because it's high in silica, it doesn't break down as quickly, but it's very easy to use and to place, and it still adds a little air circulation, but it also reduces weed seed germination. When we are planting our food crops, it's also important to understand how much sun we have in the area of the garden that we're going to be placing these plants, because many of the food crops we're going to grow require full day of sun, which is 6 hours or more. Now, if we have it's the middle of July or August, even September, and we start to get a heat wave that's unseasonably hotter than normal, these are times to keep in mind that if you feel that your garden is in full sun, your food crop is getting too much sun, it's too hot, it might be times where we have to put up some patio umbrellas or some type of a shade structure or shade cloth just to protect the plants during those times of excessive heat. It's not going to be permanent. It's just going to help during those times of excessive heat, if that's something that might be coming up for you over this next summer. We've been experiencing excessive heat in the past couple of years, so it's something that we're starting to keep in mind and utilize a little bit more often than we have in the past. Okay, we're going to talk about a little bit about companion planting. So companion planting is an idea where we are planting certain food crops together that are not going to compete for nutrients. They're going to grow together as friends and share the different nutrients in the soil without competing for that. And that's really what this is all about. These are very minimal or very basic charts I got online through Heirloom Organics. I know that the Farmer's Almanac has a very extensive list, and I'm sure if you do an online search, you'll find lists that are just these big charts that will, go through what is going to like to grow with each other and what's not going to be ideal to grow with each other. So the idea is you'd really want to plant plants that like to be friends or like to be planted together. And then the plants that would be competing for nutrients would not perform as well if they're planted with each other. And then the question always comes up, what flowers or what plants can I also add to my food crops to repel pests or to repel diseases? Well, this is where I don't have a lot of scientific factual information or data. However, I do hear that marigolds can repel a variety of pests. And what is researched, something that is scientific, is that marigolds, certain species of marigolds, will repel a certain type of pest nematodes. So if you know that you've had any type of a like a root knot nematode in that garden or any type of a pest nematode, then planting certain species of marigolds could really help with that situation. I personally just really love planting marigolds because they also attract beneficial insects when those flower petals are completely open. And I think they look pretty. Radishes, I understand, may repel cucumber beetles, which I'm very curious about. So I love planting radishes, and I don't seem to notice that I have cucumber beetles when I have radishes growing, although I'm just starting to notice if there's a correlation here. So I'd like to hear from you if you've had any experience by planting radishes to repel cucumber beetles. I also understand that calendulas may repel asparagus beetles, which can be kind of problematic for those of us that grow asparagus. But I'm not 100% sure about this. It's not a scientific fact, but it's a nice notion to consider. And I'm always open to try and see how if it really is reducing some pest problems. And then the Agastaches, which is one of my most favorite, definitely may help with repelling the cabbage moth, but more importantly, it attracts so many important pollinators, including our native pollinators. So I am a huge fan of the Agastaches. I have many all around the garden. And to come to think of it, I don't have that many cabbage moths, so perhaps it is working. Something else that's really, really, really important that a lot of us have some challenges with because of space. Space does not always allow us to. However, we have to find a way, is crop rotation. So rotating crops is just as important as fertilizing, as watering, as amending the soil. And the reason why, if we are planting the same plant in the same type of plant in the same space every year, not only are we going to find it challenging to reboost that soil with the nutrients that plant needs, it's going to also increase the likelihood of certain pests and diseases that will be even more challenging to rid your garden of later. So what I'm speaking to is specifically tomatoes. I know that a lot of us grow tomatoes. We love our tomato plants. And a lot of us have a tendency to plant the tomatoes in the same location year after year. So what I'd like to really share the importance of rotating these crops. And how we do that is ideally we have 3 different garden beds, and they don't have to be large. They could be half barrels. They could be, something larger than a half barrel, like a planting trough, or maybe a small raised bed. If your space is limited, maybe take that one large raised bed and renovate it to be smaller raised beds. But my point is that we're going to plant tomatoes in one, like raised bed number 1 the first year, and we'll have maybe lettuces in raised bed number 2, and maybe the kale and chard in raised bed number 3. And then the following year, we're going to switch those so that the kale and chards are now in raised bed number 1, tomatoes are in number 2, lettuces in number 3. In the third year, we're going to switch again. So the rotation is always kind of moving in the cycle. And then we're able to have the insurance that we're always going to be able to grow plants in their optimum health. The plants are going to be able to access the nutrients in a nice way that keeps it balanced for the soil, for the microbiology, and for the plants. I hope that makes sense. I know a lot of you are like, I only have one raised bed. How am I supposed to do that? Well, maybe find a way to get a couple half barrels or planting troughs in the garden so that you can start to practice these methods. And something to share, a lot of us plant our food in the ground, but if our soil is crummy and if we've got excessive gopher issues and we haven't grown in raised beds, it's a really great opportunity to try growing in raised beds. When we grow food in raised beds, or when we have raised beds as a planting space, we're able to add the soil that would be best for the plants that we're going to be growing. So really nice, good quality planting mix or raised bed mix could go in there. It's going to improve the drainage. We won't have any drainage issues. Whereas if we had, clay soil in the garden, now we've got a nice area to plant. We won't have to struggle with that clay. We can always line the bottom with a 1/2-inch hardware cloth or gopher wire to prevent gophers from coming up into the root systems. You get to control the soil. You get to dictate what type of soil goes in that area. We also are able to save water, believe it or not, because we're keeping the water very localized, and we're also keeping the fertilizer very localized just for those plants. And then soil compaction isn't an issue because we're not walking on the soil or on the area around those plants. We're walking around the raised bed. So if you haven't worked with raised beds before, this might be a good time to start. And they could be any shape and size. Ideally, you want something that you can reach across with your arms. If it's too wide, it'd be difficult to harvest. And sometimes making them a little taller is easier to access the food. However, they really can be any size to fit your needs. And then when I plant, I like to plant plants on a diamond grid or hexagon pattern. And the reason why is because then as they grow in, they look like they're a little denser. I can harvest every other one, so to speak. But the reason why this is ideal for me is because these plants are now creating their own mulch. They're shading the soil beneath to reduce water evaporation. They are preventing weed seeds from germinating. And it's actually creating a nicer environment for the food to grow. So that's one of the tricks I've learned, is planting on like a grid system. Another thing I like to share is growing heirloom veggies is kind of cool. It's really fun. It's very popular nowadays. We see so many varieties at our local garden centers or seed packs that are heirlooms. And the reason why this is so great for us here in California is because many of the heirloom varieties are from Mediterranean regions, which adapt very well to our Mediterranean California climate. So have a look, check out some heirloom varieties. You'll notice that many of them are going to be more drought tolerant as well and more heat resistant or resilient. So check that out. It's kind of fun. And if anyone isn't familiar with the National Heirloom Expo that happens every year up in Santa Rosa, check it out. It's really fun. Something else that I really like to share is that there's a lot of food crops that are perennials. Now, these are not our annual food crops. They don't need to get switched out every year. They don't need to get rotated or, things like that. They'll grow as perennials, as many of our flowering plants do, such as our perennial ornamentals and shrubs and such. These are plants that we plant once and we just, benefit from them for years to come. And so that's going to be things like our scarlet runner beans, our artichokes, and asparagus. So these would be plants we would maybe be fertilizing once or twice a year with dry fertilizer, and then maybe through the growing season adding the liquid, but we'd be treating them in a way that we would maybe other permanent perennial plants that we're growing around our garden. And now we're going to talk about working with cover crops. And I know a question already came in this morning about cover crops. So I'm really excited that I get to answer that question. So one of my favorite cover crops to work with, by all means, it's not the only one, but just something that's super easy and fun and actually provides a lot of food, are fava beans. Fava beans are awesome because they have this nitrogen, these little nodulars of nitrogen, which is a bacteria attached to the root systems. So these little white cotton balls or like little beads, anything in here that you see that might look like perlite. So the picture on the right is just the regular photo. And then I tried to zoom in a little bit to see, because the plant on the right is very young. It isn't really established, but that was all I could, that was the best sample I could find in my garden for the program. So normally there's even more of these little nodulars, but this is all beautiful free nitrogen for our soil and for our plants. The way we work with the fava beans to utilize that nitrogen is when the plants have grown and they're just starting to flower, is when we're going to cut them at the base. The reason why we want to cut them at the base is so we're not disrupting the root system. We want that root system to be intact. And then what happens is we're going to plant our other plants, such as our tomatoes, on that same hex grid, but just shifted so that the plants will be in between what was the fava beans. And as those plants grow, their root systems will become interwoven with the existing root systems of the fava beans so that they can access that nitrogen. Now, the reason why we cut these, the fava bean plants down right when they're just starting to flower, if we let the plants fully mature, if we let the fava bean plants fully mature, as those flowers start to develop, and then the beans start to grow, fava beans are quite large and they need all of that delicious nitrogen they just produced. The nitrogen will go from the root systems up the plant and into the bean to give it the food and energy it needs to produce the bean. So if we wait until the fava beans have already gone all the way through their cycle and have bean pods, there's not going to be enough nitrogen or significant enough nitrogen to provide any benefit to my other plants. So rule of thumb is we cut them at the base when the plants are just starting to flower. And then we have this top part that we can chop up as green manure for our compost, or we can work it into a new bed where we just let it set and decompose over a little bit of time, or we can just lay it on top as like a mulch. So lots of different things you can do with the fava bean tops. You can also even harvest the tips and saute it with sesame oil and garlic, which is delicious. And then we don't want to forget about the flowering plants. These are really important when we're growing food because we want to invite the beneficial insects. The beneficial insects are out there working for us. These are our allies, taking care of many of the pests that we'll see in the garden. So please, by all means, plant flowering plants that are going to provide nectar for our beneficial insects. And these are typically going to be plants that are that look like a daisy or a sunflower, such as the daisy on the top, excuse me, or plants that are clusters of tiny flowers, such as yarrow or alyssum, even ceanothus, erigeron, buckwheat. These are all going to be amazing insectary plants for our beneficials. And we want to plant as many varieties as possible. So planting a diversity of plants. And you can have, yarrow clustered together, multiple plants in an area, and you can have multiple daisies in an area and multiple erigerons, but just having a variety. And the reason why having a variety is so important is because here in the Bay Area, we are so lucky that we can actually be growing flowers almost year round. And that allows us to provide food for our beneficial insects and pollinators almost year round. So it's a win-win for our gardens. Now let's talk a little bit about how to plant and how to water. So when we buy a plant from the garden center, such as, this little tomato that was just in a little tiny, like 4-inch pot or a 6-pack, it's really important that we take advantage of using these little tags. Not only do they tell us a lot about the plant, the care instructions, but it's a really great tool for teasing out the roots. And it's really important. We want to kind of tease those roots. We want to, and they might rip and tear a little bit, and that's okay. We're going to be gentle, but we also want to make sure that we're encouraging roots to grow out. If we just plop that little plug in the ground, those roots are going to actually strangle themselves. So it's really important that we're going to kind of tease those roots, open them up, plant them in the ground. We're always going to plant it at the same soil level as what the plant has come to us as. That's going to be their optimum soil level. However, I think tomatoes might be the only plant that benefits from planting it deep. So if we've got a tomato plant that's about, let's say, 8 inches tall, we're going to plant it down a couple of nodes. So if we'll see the leaves from the bottom up, there'll be a pair of leaves, and then another pair of leaves, and then there'll be like the little top of the tomato. We're actually going to just nip those leaves off of the bottom 2 sets, and then we're going to bury that. And then it's going to encourage root systems. So I think tomatoes are the only ones that benefit from getting buried deeply. Anything else you want to bury at the same height as the soil. How the plant comes, that's exactly where it wants to be, no deeper. So that's something to be mindful of. And I always plant slightly up like this to allow for settling, because the soil I use is always really light and fluffy and it's going to settle some. So I want it to always settle like this. We want to be mindful that the plants are not going to settle like that, because this is when it's down a little bit, soil buildup, mulch buildup, debris buildup will occur, and then that could strangle the crown of the plant, and then your plant could suffer and not do as well as you'd like it to. So that's one little tip with that. And when we water, we've heard this before from me, we want to water deeply, and we want to encourage nice deep root systems. So remember, as we water, we're going to water, to encourage the root systems to grow down and out. So they're going to start as that little tiny plant, but over time, the root system is going to grow out and down. So we're going to start to water deeper and less often. So by August, or when our tomatoes are, 6 feet tall, we're not watering every day for 5 minutes. We might be watering once a week for, the 15, 20, 30 minutes, whatever your soil needs, whatever the capacity is at that, to make sure we're getting a nice deep watering and we're letting the top few inches of the soil dry out. Also remember, as plants mature, not only are the root systems growing throughout the soil, but the plant is growing and it's now casting shade on that soil, protecting that soil. So water is going to be evaporating out at a slower rate. At some point, we're going to prune our vegetables, such as tomatoes or summer squash. And what I mean by that is, for the tomatoes, We might be removing leaves on the bottom, let's say maybe 12 to 18 inches to add a little bit more air circulation. Still going to be the leaves, the plant itself will still be shading the soil. So the water evaporation will still be reduced. However, it's going to add a little air circulation. You also want to thin out your tomatoes because if not, they become those big monsters, right? And then as far as summer squash and larger plants, their leaves are also shading the soil. But what we know is the older leaves, like on cucumbers, summer squash, a lot of times we notice they start to dry. They're even more prone to powdery mildew. So let's just trim those off as we start to see the leaves dry out or age or become prone to powdery mildew. And it's good just to trim those off and get them off site, which is fine. But then the plant will still be growing very healthy. I hope that made sense. I felt like I kind of went into that a little long. Anyway, so now let's look at how to apply integrated pest management strategies. So when we use pesticides, so I'm going to start with the pesticides because this is just a reminder. We always want to use as a last resort. We always want to choose the least toxic and the most eco-friendly products available. We're always going to apply according to the label, and we always want to make sure that the pest that we're trying to manage is listed on the label. Remember, if that pest isn't on the label, it won't work. That pesticide won't manage the problem. We're always going to wear some type of a protective, clothing, long sleeves, non-cotton gloves, long pants, shoes. We're not going to spray when there's a breeze more than 5 miles. We're going to wear, some covering because remember, even the eco-friendlies can cause a dermal reaction to our skin. And then we want to understand the risks because no pesticide is going to be risk-free. Even eco-friendlies, everything is, if you're using a product that's designed to kill something, it's a pesticide and there's going to be risks. So tips for using pesticides is we want to understand how the active ingredients actually is supposed to work because some could take longer. So like for instance, neem, could take a number of days before we actually see any of the pest insects die, Timing's also really important. We want to understand the life cycle of that insect, the life cycle of that pest, and we're going to apply the pesticide at the best time to manage it. We're going to spot treat. We're not going to spray the whole garden because remember, we know that the aphids that are on my kale are not going to go and get on my broccoli or on my tomatoes or on my lettuces. They're very host specific. The pests are very host specific. Now, there are some pests that are a little bit more general, such as cucumber beetles, but for the most part, we're going to see them favoring certain plants in the garden. And then we're going to always apply pesticides at sundown. And the main reason why is because our beneficial insects, including our pollinators, are less likely to be active at that time. And it allows the pesticide to have the entire evening to dry. And the cool thing about eco-friendly products is that once they are dry, they're not going to pose any risks or harm to our beneficial insects or our pollinators. They also will not have residuals that will be toxic to us or our pets, our children, things like that. So it's a really great opportunity to apply a product and give it time to dry on the plant. Typically, it only takes about 30 minutes, maybe an hour for these products to dry. But I find that we're not as active in the gardens when after sundown. If we are going to release beneficial insects, give them some time to take care of that pest problem before we apply pesticides. And then also understand the unintended consequences. Really just be really conscious about what's going on and what could possibly happen unintentionally. Identifying the pest is the number one key. Oftentimes, beneficial insects get mistaken as pests. This happens every spring when I'm working in a garden center. People will bring in a Ziploc baggie full of ladybug larvae because they look really weird. They do look weird and they can be alarming. And they'll come in with this Ziploc bag and they're very upset. And I understand, we get very emotional when things in our garden are going sideways. And they'll say, these are all over my garden and they're eating my plants and I just need something to kill them. And I have to show them with a lot of literature and photos from, reputable websites such as the UCIPM website and things like that, that these are actually ladybug larvae and they're actually eating the bugs that are eating your plants. So just please take some time to properly identify the pest or the insect that you think is the pest, understand its life cycle, understand the timing and the habitat of that pest, and then hunt a little more closely. Look around and see, are there any beneficial insects present? Because if they are, they're going to actually be taking care of that problem for you. So let's look at some pest problems and how we apply IPM to these pests. So aphids love synthetic fertilizers because synthetic fertilizers stimulate a lot of new growth for that plant. And that's that tender, sugary new growth that's really easy for the piercing mouth parts on the aphids to puncture and enjoy. Excessive pruning. So if we're pruning our plants often, that's also going to stimulate new growth, which is going to attract pests such as aphids. And then understand that ants, if we ever see ants trailing up a plant, such as roses or a plum tree or citrus, that's typically an indicator to me that there's another pest problem that's going on because the ants love to farm the honeydew secretions of a lot of these insects, such as aphids, scale, thrips, whiteflies, and so forth, mealybugs. So when we see the ants, it's typically an indicator that there's another pest going on. So we have to take a closer look. And then aphids also will note when there is lack of predators. When we've got ants protecting the aphids, they're actually going to fend off the predators. They're going to fight those ladybugs and push them off the little branchlet so that the aphids can continue doing their job. So when we've got lack of predators, the aphids are extremely happy. So whiteflies also love dry, dusty conditions. It can also be a sign of sometimes if we have an a whitefly infestation, it can be an indicator of overwatering or poor drainage. Now, some plants are just magnets to whiteflies, and keep in mind that such as like some hibiscus, abutilons, some begonias. But if we happen to just all of a sudden notice a whitefly infestation, let's look at some other things. Is the plant in an area that isn't having good air circulation, or is it getting overwatered? Is the irrigation broken, or is it needing to be repotted or increase the drainage of that situation? Also, the synthetic fertilizers are going to increase the whiteflies because of that same reason why it would increase the aphids. And then again, lack of predators. Vegetable leaf miner. So there's a number of different types of leaf miners. The ones that we seed on the chard, beets, and spinach is going to be the beet leaf miner, but there's a couple other veggie leaf miners that will attack other vegetables. If it is attacking the part of the plant that we are going to eat, then I would try to address the problem. Some leaf miners, such as a leaf miner that gets on citrus, does not attack the food. So your tolerance and your strategies could be slightly different. However, for veggie leaf miner, what we're going to notice is as soon as the temperatures start to warm up, we see the activity. And the reason why is because the larval stage of that leaf miner is going to overwinter in the soil, right where those plants were planted. So let's say we had chard growing in that raised bed last year. We saw a leaf miner and we planted lettuces in that bed over the winter. But now we want to plant chard again. Well, I heard that putting row cover over my new chard plants will prevent leaf miner from coming in. It's a little fly that's going to come in and lay eggs on the leaves of the chard plants. So if I put row cover on, yes, I'm going to prevent those, the adults from coming in and laying eggs. However, if I had this chard planted last year in this area, I can be pretty sure that there's going to be some larvae from the leaf miner in the soil. And when I have this row cover on, that larva is going to hatch and it's going to stay within this nice cozy environment, and it will the pest will persist. So be mindful with row cover. Row cover can be tricky to use if we're not familiar with the pest habitat. Other than that, it could be a really wonderful way to prevent insects from coming in, especially on crops that do not need pollinators. However, what we want to do is understand that when the temperatures get warm, we're going to start to see these insects. So we're going to go out there and we're going to monitor. We're going to look for the eggs, which they literally look like mini grains of little white rice, and we could just scrape them off with our fingernail. I typically am not a fan of using a pesticide, even anything as mild as insecticidal soap, on the leafy greens because I'm going to be eating them. And I swear, even though I've washed them well enough, I can still taste the smell. I don't know. I think I've been using those products for so many years. It's just ingrained. But we're also going to notice that the larva could be in between the layers of the leaf, at which point we'd want to nip those leaves off, and we can even squish the larva between the leaves. I know it's kind of gross, but that's how we can break the life cycle. And then some eco-friendly solutions that we can use is plant more flowering plants to attract beneficial insects, such as the alyssum and the cosmos. Those are beneficial insect magnets. We're going to feed with organic fertilizers to prevent the plant stress. We're going to irrigate the plants properly, remember, deeply, and we're letting the soil dry out a few inches before we water again once the plants become more established. We're also making sure that we're watering evenly all the way around the plant. We're going to use sticky traps as monitoring devices. We can wipe the pests off. And then we can also use very narrow range pesticides such as insecticidal soap. And then there's also an assortment of oils such as neem and organocide, which is sesame oil. We're always going to apply according to the label's directions. And then fungal problems such as powdery mildew, rust, and black spot. Well, we can apply very similar practices. One, we want to respond to the cause. Do we know why this is happening, or is this something that's just very natural and normal? Is this plant prone to get this disease, such as, roses are very prone to black spot and rust. So we know that. Zucchini, summer squash is very prone to powdery mildew. So we know that. So we're already going to be prepared to monitor and remove those leaves when we see it. And if it's a problem that is not prone, like if it's a plant that isn't prone to that problem, then we're going to increase the air flow, we're going to water properly, and we're going to fertilize properly. And then when it comes to powdery mildew, understand that powdery mildew is not a waterborne disease. It's actually it's a spore that blows in the wind. And actually by watering it, by hosing off the powdery mildew, it's actually breaking the spores or popping the spores, and it can actually get washed off. But the thing is that we have to keep in mind is the powdery mildew is not only on the top of the leaf, but it's also on the bottom of the leaf. So we want to also address the spores underneath the leaf. So if we are going to just wash off the powdery mildew, make sure we've also washed it off underneath the leaf. And then we can use an assortment of eco-friendly fungicides that is an assortment. There's an assortment out there such as the sulfur, the copper soaps, the neem, organocide, and then there's some beneficial bacterias that are available. But again, when we apply them, we want to apply to the top and the bottom of the plant tissue and always apply according to the directions. And then rodents in the garden are always a problem. Once we have our harvests are in full force. So it's always nice to remove places of harborage. So those ivy, ground cover areas, those wood piles, anywhere the rodents might be living. We want to make sure our chicken coops and our compost are contained and the rodents can't access them. We want to keep the lids on the garbage cans. We want to reduce the pet food availability. So if we're feeding our pets outdoors, we want to maybe limit that to just a short amount of time so that the rodents also aren't enjoying that. We want to rethink bird feeders because bird feeders are also, a big problem and attract the rodents. we want to eliminate their food sources. And how we do that is with our food crops, we're going to actually create barriers to prevent them from accessing our food crops, which I'll show you in a moment. And then we want to harvest our food. We want to make sure we are out there harvesting our food on a regular basis. Exclusion frames and exclusion baskets could look like this. For rats, mice, and voles, we're going to work with 1/4-inch hardware cloth. That's just the wire fencing that we find at the hardware store that's galvanized. Gophers, we'll work with 1/2-inch hardware cloth. For squirrels and rabbits, we work with 3/4-inch fencing or poultry wire or similar. And the deer fencing, of course, is always going to be 7 feet tall or taller. Gophers, which are a huge problem all around the Bay Area, we work with 1/2-inch hardware cloth or official gopher wire to create baskets or line raised beds. And yes, that is my beautiful butternut squash that was feasted on by a gopher. Can't believe it when I saw that. And so tips on maintaining our veggie garden is we're going to build healthy soil. We're going to feed our veggies with good quality organic fertilizers. We're going to water the root systems to encourage nice deep root systems. We're going to grow biodiversity to invite the pollinators and beneficial insects. We're going to monitor for pest problems. We're going to harvest the food, and we're going to enjoy the bounty. So a couple online resources I can share is the UCIPM website, which is an amazing resource to help us navigate through a lot of those problems that we might see in the garden, as well as a library of fact sheets on the Our Water, Our World website. And then some fun books that I have in my library that I reference a lot this time of year is Pam Pierce's The Golden Gate Gardening, as well as the Sunset Western Garden book and the Sunset Western Book of Edibles. And so with that, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. I really appreciate your time and attention. And so let's finish with your questions.
Thanks, Suzanne. Wow. I think what I like so much about your presentations is it's really accessible for beginner gardeners, and also experienced gardeners learn a lot too, like myself.
Oh,
So
great.
thank you so much. Yeah, that was great. We do I want to know, a couple people are asking about the slides for the presentation, and I do want to remind you that the recording will be available. If I don't delete it, no, it's not going to be deleted. I cleared up the cloud. It's all good. It's all good. So the recording will be available by Tuesday. Typically, the webinar recordings are available on SLOAT's website the Tuesday following the class, and you can, fast forward, pause, screenshot, rewind, whatever, and look back over the presentation. And then I also wanted to note, because you did mention companion planting, and it's such a huge passion of mine, that SLOAT actually does have an extensive companion planting list on our website, and it's under the Learn tab under the plant care and stuff. So that's a resource there for sure.
Awesome.
And then a lot of people are asking for more in-depth watering information. And I do want to remind you, if you missed Suzanne and Charlotte's presentation on water-wise gardening, that is a super great reference. The recording is available on our website, and they both went into way more depth on how long to water, when to water, how to water, all those questions that we're getting, and that's available on our website as well. And people are so excited about all this, so I'm excited too.
Fun. I know.
It's so fun. It's so fun. And then I do want to remind you, because people are asking more in depth about the insects, that Suzanne will be back on April 17th for a more extensive insect and disease identification and presentation. And then also she'll be back May 1st for eco-friendly pest and disease.
Yeah. So yeah, the 17th is good bug, introduction to good bugs in the garden, who we're going to see what they look like, and some look-alike pets. So, sometimes they look like some bad bugs, sometimes bad bugs look like the good bugs. So we'll go into that. Yeah, and then the first we're talking about pest management. We're going to dive in a little bit more with the pest problems and how we manage them with a less toxic approach.
Yeah, absolutely. And like we said, the more you can stay on top of this really is going to be the best, you know, program for you.
Yeah,
So just be aware and stay on top of it. And then for anybody asking additional tomato questions, we are having an all tomato presentation by Dan Alexander, who's our edible expert. And that's going to be April 10th.
that's going to be great.
It's going to be awesome. And so anyways, like you said, it's a really exciting time of the year. And so and I can sense the enthusiasm. So that's super awesome. And then I wanted to address a couple different questions people were asking about small space gardening. And like you said, not everybody has the luxury of being able to rotate crops if you just have one space to grow. And sort of combining that with a question on fabric planters, because
Mhm.
I've actually used the fabric planters in a location because I've only been able to grow tomatoes in one location. And so I think that they're great. If you just have that one location, you can just plop
Yeah,
a fabric planter on top of it, right?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. I'm a huge fan. In fact, I had to kind of move one area. I've got garlic growing in 3 fabric planters right now. So the thing with the fabric planters is they're easy to move, they're lightweight, they're super flexible, but they also have a tendency to dry out. So just be mindful that they might need to get watered a little bit more regularly or a little more often than your other plants because of the wind exposure or air exposure along the sides of the roots. Other than that, just be mindful you're not overwatering. We want to make sure we are letting that soil dry out a little bit, but excellent. And they come in so many different sizes. So uh, I always say the largest you can handle, and then fill that up with some really good planting mix or raised bed mix or, proper soil, and always ask the associates at the store what they think would be the best. They'll guide you. And then, yeah, that is, they're awesome.
Well, and what's nice too is after the season, you can just dump them out and throw them in the washer and fold them up, and they don't take up space too.
Yeah.
Um, a few questions on cover crops. First of all, what is a cover crop, and is it when do you plant it? So can you still plant one now, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. So cover crops are typically going to protect the soil in between your planting seasons. So if you're the person that only grows, summer veggies, so you're planting your vegetables now, your annual crops, and you'll harvest everything by the end of September or October. And that would be like cucumbers and tomatoes and summer squash, things like that. If you and peppers and eggplant and all that, if you're that type of person, it's really nice for your soil, for the health of your garden, to plant a cover crop over those winter months to protect the soil. And ideally, you would be working with fava beans, because fava beans really thrive in cooler temperatures, and they're going to give you back all that nitrogen that they're going to give you free nitrogen, as well as help with the aeration of the soil with the root systems and things like that. Plus, they're a food. However, it's not the only cover crops. There's Botanical Interests they're pretty cool. It's a seed company that you'll find at, places like Sloat Garden Center. And they have a nice selection of cover crops, these different types of packs. One of them is called Soil Builder, and I believe it's peas and oats. I don't remember exactly. I don't have it in front of me. And essentially the idea is that you'll grow it and then you'll cut it. It's creating green manure, so that that gets ideally, I think that the intention is that it will get turned into the top couple inches of the soil before you plant. You have to read the packet. I haven't looked at the packet for a while, so I can't remember 100%. Another thing to keep in mind is when we work with cover crops, a lot of times they're supporting the soil structure to improve it. And also, when we mow it down or cut down the tops, it's a resource for our compost. So again, another way to get green manure on our properties.
Great. And how do you feel about chicken or steer manure, either in place of compost or in addition to compost?
Well, steer manure and chicken manure, when it is not fresh, it has to be aged. And at which point, at the time of us receiving it, it's going to be quote unquote composted. So it is going to oftentimes be an additive in a lot of the bags of compost that we might buy. I think that these are, perfectly fine for folks to use. I have a tendency to not use steer manure. I think that sometimes the commercial steer manures can be high in salts, is what I understand, or higher in salts. Um, Chicken manures are wonderful, especially for some of our perennial food crops, especially if we do a top dressing. So we'll fertilize around the drip line of that perennial, such as asparagus or, artichokes or citrus. So we'll fertilize and then we'll do a nice layer of like chicken manure on top of that with the mulch on top. And then we just kind of let the microbiology do its trick. But we can certainly turn in chicken manure. I know that most of the products I use already have the chicken manure blended with it, so I'm not buying anything extra or individually.
Okay, great. And then you did talk about rodents, but what about birds? So birds can be kind of aggressive. And do you have any
Yeah.
tech?
So the birds, so we go back to this slide right here. This is really including and not limited to bird netting. So when we have birds coming in and eating like our green bean leaves or our cucumber leaves or picking our lettuces, this is an opportunity to think about exclusion. So how can we exclude the critters that are coming in and eating our food? And it's not limited at rodents. It could be squirrels, it could be rabbits, it could be birds. And what I have is I literally have these baskets. So it's kind of like a combination between the two middle photos where it's just on these, 1 by 1 frames. I've made a frame and then I've stapled some hardware cloth, and there's like an upside down shoebox, but I can lift it up and put it over. They're super lightweight, they're tall, so I could put it over my leafy greens, or I've got shorter ones that go over my strawberries. And it prevents the birds, but it still allows the pollinators to come in and do their job. It also prevents rodents and any other critter that might want to come and feed on my plants.
Yeah, and there's also that scare tape that's like that reflective tape, and that can help. And
Sure
then,
does.
um,
Scare tape works really well. I'll go through and with clothespins kind of pin it up in my fruit trees. And it has a tendency to work extremely well to prevent the birds from coming over.
and that's why you might see, which I have in the city, people hanging old CDs around their vegetable garden because that does the same thing. It's that reflection.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So you can, upcycle your old CDs and use them
Oh
in.
my gosh.
Um, okay, lots of good questions. And I do want to note that if we didn't address your, because there's a lot of specific questions, and if we didn't address them, feel free to email either Suzanne or myself,
Mhm.
and we can try to address them. Do you have any, just with regards to sun exposure? I mean, if you have a part sun situation, what can you consider growing or not growing?
Part sun a lot of the leafy greens grow extremely well in part sun. That would be like the chard, the kale, broccolis, lettuces. I think carrots can thrive in part sun. I'm not 100%. I think so. And onions. garlic. There's a lot of things that can thrive in part sun. The question is if it's hot sun or cool sun. That's something to keep in mind. And if it's a cooler part sun, then you'd want to look at cool season crops, crops that would grow best during the cool time of the year. And if it's hot part sun, then you'll look at summer crops, crops that would thrive best in the warmer time. And basil does really well. Cucumbers do really well. They will prefer to have a little bit of shade. I know tomatoes really want full sun. Peppers could benefit from a little bit of shade if it's hot. I think depending where you live, I would talk to the nursery professionals because they can guide you for your area specifically.
Okay, great. Well, like I said, this has been incredibly informative, and I think we all want to get out and plant our veggie garden right now. It's such a nice day. So I think, like I said, if we didn't address your questions, feel free to email us. But get outside and get in your garden today. This is such a pretty day. Thanks again, Suzanne, for all of your information. It's so valuable, and I really appreciate it. And everyone, have a great day. Stay safe, stay healthy, take care. Thanks so much. Happy Saturday.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, everyone. It was really great. Enjoy. Have fun.